Welcome. We're honored to have you listen and participate in these dialogues produced by the Cora de Broutsov Foundation. To learn more about the Foundation and about how you can help us in our mission of unearthing untold stories of moral energy, please visit us at virtuesofpeace.com. There you can access show archives, show resources, visit our Etsy shop, and support us with a donation. virtuesofpeace.com.
Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope Elizabeth May and I am joined today by Randy Olson. And we are coming back after about a 2-month-long hiatus, and we are back with this show to mark the 30th anniversary, which is not today, August 12th, 2021, but this Saturday, August 14th, 2021, marks the 30th anniversary of when Kim Hak Sun, a Korean woman, breaks the silence and tells the truth about her experience as a victim of the military sexual slavery of Japan during World War II. You may know of this or have heard of this as the, quote, comfort woman issue. It really begins this movement. It's now a movement, and Korea is at the forefront of this international movement. But really, it's 30 years ago on August 14th when Kim Hak Sun gives a famous press conference that begins the movement that is still going on today. It is evolving and growing, and we're here because this is an extremely important story of peace through law. It is a difficult story, but at least in Korea, the movement is a peace movement. So that's what we will be talking about today. And we will begin by focusing on a book called One Left, which is an historical novel by Kim Soom, a Korean author. And I believe she published this in Korean in 2016, but then it was translated into English by Bruce and Ju-Chan Fulton in 2020. And I want to thank the Korean consulate in Chicago, in particular the Consul General Young Suk Kim and also Misu Kim, who sent the team here at Virtues of Peace copies of this novel, One Left. We will begin by talking about the novel and then also talk about the legal aspects of the comfort woman movement in a general way. It can get very technical, but our aim is to expose you to this story, the importance of this story, why it's relevant to peace through law, and how it impacts international law and also domestic law, as we'll talk about. So I just want to begin by, if you're a listener of this show, you know that we like to zoom out and talk about history before World War I, and in particular, the Hague Peace Conferences, and going back even further, this woman, Bertha von Suttner. And I just want to begin by zooming out and connecting Kim Hak Sun and the comfort woman issue to the work of Bertha von Suttner, because I see that this issue is a descendant. The comfort woman issue descends from the foundation laid by Bertha von Suttner and other peace through law activists. And why is that the case? Well, Bertha von Suttner, if you don't know, in 1889 published an historical novel. So again, we have One Left, which is an historical novel, which we'll talk about in a moment. But in 1889, Bertha publishes an historical novel called Lay Down Your Arms. This is the book that made her famous. and launched her into international celebrity. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905, the first woman to do so. And she, in that novel, breaks the silence. And how does she do that? Until she published that novel, the only narrative of war was one in which war was linked to virtues, and in particular, the virtues of patriotism and courage and heroism. Uh, and Bertha von Suttner, in her novel Lay Down Your Arms, takes issue with that narrative. And she does so by focusing on the impact of war on the family, and in particular on a woman. Um, so the woman is not a victim of sexual slavery in Bertha's novel. However, she suffers great loss. She loses two husbands, possibly a son. We don't know. The novel ends with her son making a toast to his firstborn child. And we don't know what's going to happen to him. But I just want to say this piercing the veil of this narrative of war as something good begins with Bertha's novel. It's not exactly true, but she does this by focusing the light on the family, on these like private relations. And so what One Left also does is pierce the veil by focusing on how war is connected to sexual violence. So this is the theme. This is a theme that we see not only in World War II, but as we'll talk about later, these ad hoc UN tribunals, the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, the ICTR, which dealt with Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide. Sexual violence is a part of war, and it's been a long time in upgrading our international legal instruments to identify it and criminalize it. And so the Comfort Woman is part of this reframing of war to recognize its true impact on persons and in particular on women. Um, so this has to do with bringing to consciousness something very difficult, painful history. This is not 100% positive history, which we call the red thread. This is painful history, which we also must reckon with the notion of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is a term that we get from the German attempt to transcend their difficult history of Nazism and National Socialism. And so that's a sort of like wider frame of the issue that we're going to talk about. Again, this is really like unearthing these actual stories connected to armed conflict, um, and then upgrading our behavior and our institutions so that this doesn't happen again. So, Randy, I don't know if you want to.
Sure. I mean, so I want to first point out that the book that we're going to be really diving into was not my first encounter with the comfort women issue. Um, However, and I think that this is significant, every time I'd hear about comfort women until reading this book, it was like there was a fog associated with it where it was like the idea was lumped together in a category of atrocities that didn't have salience, like it didn't reach me individually. And it required a certain kind of story, a narrative, in order to make the issue something that came alive, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, it's one thing to hear, I mean, just to draw an analogy, right? We spoke about like National Socialism. Like, it's one thing to hear about Auschwitz, and it's another thing to read Man's Search for Meaning,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not the same thing to get some statistical report. And so today we're going to be talking about the story,
Mm,
and ideally we can make the issue relevant.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Good.
so yeah, that's
Yeah,
that's where I want to go.
that's great. Yeah, I think what you're getting at is, this importance of individual testimony. Am I hearing?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And like right on. And I like you. It's the same. I'd heard of the issue in a sort of like general context having to do with sexual violence at the level of international law. Um, and then and I'll talk about it in a moment, but like the importance of like piercing, like we talked about piercing the narrative of war, but like piercing the label comfort women. And by the way, that label is not enjoyed by all. So instead of that, some people have proposed, sexual slavery. But whatever the label is, it's a general term. And to pierce beyond it and to start to hear the testimony of actual women and to know their names. It's not just Korean women, it's women in China, it's women in the Philippines, etc. Um, and so to at least to make an effort to know an individual story. So Kim Hak Sun, who I mentioned, of course, is probably the most famous individual associated with this issue. But what's really nice about One Left, it doesn't do it explicitly, and the protagonist is a fictitious woman. However, the author weaves into the novel testimony from numerous actual victims, including Kim Bok Dong and Gil Won Ok, who um, Kim Bok Dong died recently, unfortunately, but these are two that were very prominent, and I had the privilege of encountering a number of times in Seoul at the Wednesday demonstration, which we'll talk about. But the novel One Left incorporates numerous actual remarks of actual victims. It doesn't do so very explicitly, so there are footnotes. And if you look at the back of the novel, you can see the names of all the different women who made these remarks. So indeed, and so Randy, what you're saying is that like it was this novel that and like the individual testimony in it that helped to bring it to life for you.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'm just gonna like do a first pass and then a second like we'll go in deeper, but like
Mhm,
I'm gonna build the foundation just for anybody who's never heard the phrase comfort women before
mm,
and just like start there and then
cool.
move into specificity.
Awesome.
So first of all, um we're talking about Korea during World War II. And so Japan has like colonized Korea and is basically doing all of the horrible things you imagine during an occupation of a country to the Korean citizens, and we've talked about that in previous shows. Um, and so one of the things that they do is there's a system associated with effectively kidnapping women or lying to them and then taking them far away from their homes and
And
putting them in.
teenage, and I was supposed to say teenagers. You say
Yeah, yeah,
women.
yeah, yeah.
These are
Like,
teenage girls, and that's another like for salience purposes. Okay.
yeah, yeah. We're
Uh, uh,
talking like
yeah.
12, 13-year-old
Yeah.
girls.
Hmm.
I mean, young people are
Hmm.
being like kidnapped
Hmm.
in some cases or like lied to, and it's like you have a job offer and you just have to come to work at the silk factory, and so you show up for your job interview or whatever, but you don't actually get anywhere because when you get off the train there's people with guns and they drag you into the field. So it's like there's a system in Korea organized by like as part of this Japanese occupation that's the frame of what this story is about. And so we're talking about the experience of the people inside of that system who are taken and abused in an extraordinary way to the absolute limit of what the human mind can imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, so we can get into the actual story if you want, or would you like to do some other preliminary stuff first?
I'll just, since I just briefly touched on Kim Bok Dong and Gil Won Ok and the Wednesday demonstration, let me just go back to that briefly, and then you can do a quick summary. But I just want to, and this goes back to like your claim, Randy, about like when you first heard this issue. And I just want to say, just like, um, I didn't learn about this in any of my formal education. And I first encountered it through my work at the International Criminal Court, where someone in something called the Trust Fund for Victims told me about this issue and how there had been a mock trial called the Women's War Crime Tribunal in the year 2000. I then learned from other people in The Hague about this Wednesday demonstration, which happens every Wednesday in Seoul in front of the Japanese embassy, where there is a very famous statue called the Peace Statue, which is basically a young Korean girl sitting, looking very intrepid with a bird on her shoulder. Um, and women, men, students, um, all shapes and sizes gather every Wednesday. I think it's from noon to 1 to compel Japan to own up to this history. So I learned about it there, and I just want to like plant these pieces because if you're interested, like really Korea and something called the Korean Council for Justice and Remembrance for the Issues of Military Sexual Slavery by Japan, which is basically an NGO, an umbrella NGO of over 30 organizations in Korea, is really at the forefront of this movement, these demonstrations, the statue, etc. And if you Google peace statue comfort women, you'll see that this is a very controversial statue that, as in most recently in Berlin, they wanted to install this statue, and then the Japanese embassy sort of protest. The Japanese embassies don't like this statue. Japan doesn't like this statue, and there was a sort of controversy about it, and there was a decision to not install it, and now it is being installed. It's a big issue. We could do a whole show on that, but I just want to mention these pieces before we get into the book, in terms of like the movement in Korea, the peace statue, at the Wednesday demonstration, and the Women's War Crime Tribunal. That's 2000. All of this really begins after Kim Hak Sun in 1991 does this thing. And that begins all of this that has led to the statue. The Wednesday demonstrations have been going on in Korea since 1992, right? So shortly after Kim Hak Sun comes out in August of 1991. So there's a little thread, some pieces of the thread, and now we can go into the book.
Yeah. So just one more piece to that.
Mm,
Just tying in this, like, why would the international community be involved?
mm,
Just like to put the big pin in it, it's like there's these clauses in the UN Charter about the gravity of a crime, and the situation in there was 200,000 comfort women. That's the estimate, right? That's the number.
mhm,
So we're dealing with like this isn't just like a couple people. This isn't like there was one like brigand of Japanese soldiers who were just out of control. It was like, no. This is 200,000 people.
mhm,
So that's like it definitely meets the gravity clause. And so that's just another pin. Like we're
mm.
dealing with this was a big moment. This is not just a couple people.
Yeah, and it's throughout Asia. It's not just Korea.
Yeah.
So that's important. And I think when you're talking about gravity, or are you talking about the Rome Statute? I don't think the UN Charter mentions gravity
I
crimes.
well, I'm not sure now. I've got myself twisted around, but I'm just highlighting the fact that it was significant.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know if there's a specific word I need to push at, but I know I know that it's an international issue when there's this many people involved, and it was multiple
yeah.
countries, and so it's like that's all.
Yeah, that's really good, and we're going to talk about international law in more detail later. But now, just because, as Bertha says, it takes three times, three
Right.
passes to really understand something. Let this be our first pass, and let me say that not only is it an international issue because of gravity, but also because of human rights. That's a whole nother show on that, and the UN Charter absolutely mentions human rights, and we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But one important thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about, World War II. So Japan surrenders in 1945. We just came off of the anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so that's August 6th, Hiroshima, August 9th, Nagasaki, and Japan surrenders shortly after that on August 15th, informally. By the way, August 15th, so it's really important. You have August 14th, which is Kim Hak Sun making her testimony. August 15th is Gwangbok in Korea, also known as Return of the Light. That's the translation, or Liberation Day. So that's when Japan informally surrenders. Their formal surrender is in September 1945. And so, as we have said, right, the last show that we did was on Evelyn Grubb and her petition to the United Nations, and her talking about these human rights violations and the Geneva Conventions. And as we said on those shows from 2 months ago, the Geneva Conventions were not upgraded until 1949. Okay, so Japan surrenders in 1945. And so one of the issues with international law is, if these crimes occurred in 1945, are there instruments in existence that can remedy these harms? We're going to talk about this later, but I'm again planting the seed, because there are things like the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute. It only takes effect when the country signs it, unless they lodge, a declaration. But that's basically how it works. And so it doesn't go back in time. And so that's one of the issues here. And it's why it's still a living issue, because there is no remedy, right? The Korean courts are injecting some jurisprudence into this development. We'll get there later. But
Yeah.
yeah, so it's widespread and systematic, as you point out. And this happens around, 1945-ish. Okay. Japan formally surrenders then. So that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah,
All right.
so now let's do a second pass.
All right, cool.
So we'll go into the actual storytelling component, where it's like, okay, so what happened? Right? What are we really talking about?
Mm,
So, you know, the story, like the skeleton of the story is, it's following one woman
mhm,
from her teenage years all the way to the end of her life.
mhm,
And this woman finds out that she's going to be basically the last living voice of the comfort women. There's this news article where, like, the last known survivor is on her deathbed, essentially. And so the story is this woman reliving her memories in an attempt to get to in, to develop the courage to go visit this woman and to tell this woman that she is not the last voice of this atrocity, right?
mm,
So it's like this, it's a horrible story packaged into a heroic model of, facing the past and
mm.
doing one's doing one's duty in the most, horrifying way. So that's like the main skeleton, and then the actual story really is the details of her memories about what took place. And so like as she's trying to generate the courage to go and get on the train basically to go see this other person, there's all these traumas that come to her mind. And so you get to walk through them one by one. And so, roughly speaking, it starts with her as a 13-year-old girl, and her mom asks her to go out and basically collect some snails, right, for food. And so she's out there collecting snails and gets kidnapped by people with guns. And she ends up on this train, and she's not the only one on the train. So she meets a group of girls who are all roughly her age. And each one of the girls has a different story to tell about where they think they're going. So the main character isn't told about a destination. It's just like this blank mystery nightmare. And she's, terrified, and that's spelled out in the story. But then some of the girls on the train are like, I'm supposed to be a nurse, or I'm supposed to be going to a silk factory, or I was promised a job working in a textile situation. And it's like there's this deceptive feeling of optimism and hope where it seems like the girls volunteered to be here in this situation. There's this level of deception involved right from the go. So they arrive at the Manchuria Comfort Station, and they're introduced to a woman named Haha, which is mom in Japanese. And Haha is basically their like I don't know the right word for it, but the person responsible for feeding them, but also kind of imprisoning them. It's like there's a weird relationship with this character because you rely on this, like all these girls rely on her for a lot of things, but she's definitely complicit in their slavery. And right away, like Haha teaches them how to like properly use a condom and what it's for. And up until this point, like none of these girls know where they are or what they're supposed to be doing. And then it's like it slowly starts to sink in, like what do you mean we have to take soldiers? Like that, and it takes some time to even digest that that's about to happen. From there, there's an enormous amount of detail about like the methods by which the girls in this situation are trapped and have no means to escape. Like they're not in a place where they know how to get around, first of all. They're kind of in the middle of nowhere, so they can't just get up and walk away. They're like there's a monetary system in place where like Haha is exchanging money for these tokens, and the tokens are what are delivered to the girls. So the girls never really get money. Even if they knew how to use money, they're never really given any. They're given like, casino tokens effectively. And their bodies are used and abused to the absolute limit, repeatedly by, somewhere in the ballpark of 10 to 20 people a day for years. And so that's like the main, that like I think that's a sufficient second pass. It's a nightmare. The main character eventually ends up getting out of the nightmare because Japan loses the war, and she makes her way back to a place where she's living. And then you return to the story of her trying to go visit the other last known survivor, and to acknowledge and to like just to see each other and all of the pain associated with those memories. And not just pain, right? That's where I want to go on the third pass. It's not just pain. Like there's so much associated with that we have to unpack. But I think I'll pause there before
before going further.
Yeah, I think that's a superb summary, and I'll just say that, yeah, as you said, it goes into detail uh, about what actually happened, and it is not an easy book to read, and I could not read it. I'd have to put it down. So this is a book that it had to be written, and for the reasons that you said, in part, Randy, that focusing on the story of an individual, and although the individual is a fictitious individual, the actual experiences that are discussed come from actual statements of actual victims, and you can see those in the footnotes. I think like both of us have a passage that we want to focus on, and perhaps I think it's more fitting for you to focus on your passage, and then I'll focus on mine. I think yours is on page 11.
Yeah. So the I want to go there in 1 second, but
Okay, cool.
I wanna like, as part of the wrapping up the second pass through, I
Mm,
think I want to stress one other thing associated with like this idea of a debt, because I think that
mm,
psychologically this starts to play a significant role, especially over time. Um, so when the girls arrive at this place, obviously they're not here consensually, but what happens is if they ask to leave, Haha explains that they owe her money because she's been providing them with food for the last however long they've been there. They have to pay for like the dress that they're forced to wear every night for the soldiers and stuff like this, right? So there's a debt system that makes it impossible to leave, which is something that people who study slavery or slavery-based systems will understand. It's a similar thing to what happened with sailors for like 100 years. It's still actually going on today in Southeast Asia. I mean, this is the way it's done,
mm-hmm,
where you're promised work. As part of the work, you have to sign up with certain things that have a cost, and then there's this debt that you can never pay off.
mm-hmm. It also happens in the United States
Yeah,
sometimes.
like in trucking. Yeah, it's a thing in the United States too. You're
Yeah,
right.
but not. I'm talking about like sex trafficking.
Well,
Are you?
right.
Are you, yeah. So yeah, this whole
It,
indentured servitude thing.
right. And I want to pull that in because there's this emphasis of shame and hopelessness packaged into that, which is
Mm,
very pervasive for the entire book.
mm,
It's the bedrock emotionally, where yes, there's all this horror, but there's no way out, and
mm,
there's nothing you can do about it. Like that's the feeling when you're reading it. So you get all these spikes of horror with no corresponding like optimism or hope or chance of escape or anything. It's like, nope, you're done,
mm,
and it's nothing but bad roads ahead. So with that in mind, early on in the book, there's this conversation. The woman who's elderly at this point is reflecting, and she asks herself, is it a sin if you're the only one who survives, even if the place you survived is hell?
mm,
And this woman is like late in life, still struggling with this shame and guilt associated with being involved in a system where so many people were victimized. And I just there's this that has to sink in, that this kind of pain, this kind of experience, it doesn't just happen in the past.
mm,
It's like for every day for someone's life, that is an ongoing component of every emotionally valent experience that you have. And all the way to the point where it's like she's in the process of trying to decide what to do about telling this story and decide what to do about like going to visit the last person. And it's like immediately there's these roadblocks that are enormous. And it's so, of course, like there's a concept of sin that's packaged in. That's we can talk about that if you want, but like somebody can still feel guilty and ashamed of a situation that they definitely did not, they're not responsible for, which is insane. So I can go, I'll go on, but I'll pause for a second. I know you have a lot to say there.
We do. Yeah, all, superb again. Really insightful remarks. And so, yeah, the whole issue of like guilt and shame being ever present and dominating the psyche. Yeah, a lot to unpack there. So this is like the psychological piece. You said earlier when you were describing the book that, you used a phrase of, their bodies were violated and abused to like in ways that we cannot imagine, and souls as well, psyches as well. And you're talking about that aspect of it. And we on this show, and before the show, even today when we were talking before we started recording, blame. And we've talked about the concept of blame shifting, and this is a blame shifting or blaming yourself for something that you really had no control over. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get beyond that. So that's one piece. The other piece is like this thing about hopelessness, and there's no way out. So we have done a few shows on Howard Thurman, who is famous for his like fastening on that aspect of some people's experience, right? So his most famous book is, Jesus and the Disinherited. And Howard Thurman, again, if you're hearing that name for the first time, check out our other podcasts about him. But he lays the philosophical and spiritual foundation for the civil rights movement. He was the pastor of Marsh Chapel, where Martin Luther King Jr. would go and listen to him, to Howard Thurman, and take notes. And he was the first African American to meet with Gandhi in India. So he fastens on this aspect of experience of some people, right? This utter hopelessness. The phrase that Howard Thurman uses is backs against the wall. What do you do when your back is against the wall and there's nowhere to move? His book is about that. I highly recommend it. He identifies 3 hounds of hell of people like Pungil, who's the protagonist, and one left. Like, be careful, because your psyche may be and probably will be attacked by the 3 hounds of hell. Who are they? Hypocrisy, fear, and hatred. You don't really see, I didn't, and there's like, and the book has been criticized a little bit about like being, and this is in the afterword of the book, that this is sort of like a hatred against the Japanese. And I don't see that, actually. And there are, as the afterword points out, so check that out. The afterword is written by the translators Bruce and Ju-Chan Fulton. But the author also, and you talked about the complicity, the author also sort of points to the complicity of Koreans. And also, like, because Koreans, sometimes they were the ones peopling these comfort stations. And there's moments, there's at least one, I can't recall the page offhand, but there's one moment where there's a kind of like understanding and forgiveness of these Japanese soldiers, because they too have been lied to and manipulated and so forth, right? So yeah, what you're talking about is like this big psychological piece, and I'm no expert, but this is trauma, clearly, that has not been properly dealt with. We're still dealing with it. And I also see like the title of this show is From Breaking the Silence to Being Heard: Military, Sexual Slavery, and Peace Through Law. And this like decision of Gil to visit the last remaining comfort woman, or the one who's been identified at any rate, as like this sort of need to be heard, to fully heal, and like to have one's experiences validated, right? And to have the offender like recognize the wrong and be heard, in particular by the offender. So this is an extremely important part of the healing from this trauma, is being heard and being seen. And I will stop there.
Yeah, well, so okay, I wanna give a tactile, that's not the right word, but a clear example of what the significance of being heard would allow. Because basically, until there's certain kinds of acknowledgement, there's a perversion of values that are built in because of certain kinds of situations in a horrific environment like this. So here's an example. One of the things that would happen is girls who got pregnant had their uteruses cut out, right? It was a problem if you got pregnant. And so one of the so the girls in the situation who are, again, we're talking about teenage girls, are have it really literally slammed into their minds that being pregnant is bad. Now, when we ask ourselves, like, well, if we step back, it's like, okay, the woman and child is a sacred symbol. Like the Madonna is a sacred symbol for like unbelievably large number of reasons. And 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 suddenly there's this enormous set of circumstances imposed upon these girls, which make that symbol no longer sacred. It's something that's to be feared, to be avoided at all costs, because the likelihood that that's a nightmare for you for the rest of your life is guaranteed. And so, like, okay, so now what does that do for a person? Like psychologically, you've inverted the most holy thing that humans have ever come in contact with. Like that symbol has significant power. How do you deal with that over the course of your life if there's never, like, at some point the state needs to have some kind of intervention, right? There needs to be a cultural acknowledgement that there was a mistake here, so that the value systems can be properly oriented. And at the level of the individual, this is so obvious, right? It's like when a teenage girl starts to think that there's nothing good about pregnancy, that it's something that's bad, that it's something to be avoided, we can see clearly where the issue is, right? That's a clearly unsustainable situation. And then when we scale up to the level of if we scale up to the level of the state, we have to do the same kind of psychological reevaluation. The values need to get reorganized, and the acknowledgement is the precondition for that.
Yeah, cool. Some people might take issue with the Madonna child being sacred for all women. I won't go there, but I do agree that there's a perversion of values going on, and I can't remember it word by word, but we have on this show again. Here comes Bertha von Suttner again. So like one of her quotes that we have said on the show, I believe, is something like, politics can only become something worthy of humanity until the essentially feminine qualities of gentleness and dignity penetrate political life, right? And I see like what you're saying is in that vein, that the state has to become, more accurate with its protection of values and the value hierarchy. Right on. And that point actually that you're making, that is like what's happening in international law around this issue and others. But when we're talking about the value system of international relations, a term that I don't really care for, but when we talk about the value system of our international system, what's the governing value system? And like, what's the reigning value? Is it state sovereignty? Is it sovereign immunity? Or is it redress for victims, right? Because that right there, I think, sort of sums up what we're sort of working through at present, and the comfort woman issue is helping us do that. And Korean courts are making very interesting input into that discussion. So go ahead.
Well, just to layer on the same issue a little further, I mean, I don't know how we can get away from the idea that the state is a collection of people. Like, and I don't want to minimize the issue, but in some point, I have to, because we're dealing with some things that are pretty straightforward, where, when an individual is going into therapy, the very first thing that that the therapist deals with is denial, right? If a person doesn't admit that there's a problem, there's no repairing it. Carl Rogers demonstrated that clearly. And it's like, you need acknowledgement before treatment can even begin. And that's at the level of the individual. So when we scale up, we're dealing with trying to address a cultural episode and trying to draw the appropriate conclusions. And the very first thing that has to occur is overcoming denial, right? And I think that this is true in all cases of atrocity crime. But in this case, it's been what, 30 years, and there's still like this serious conversation as to whether the Japanese have acknowledged it sufficiently. Now, of course, the word sufficiently there is loaded. I don't know, I can't speak to that like intelligently, but I know that there's like the idea that they're still demonstrating every week, like, it must not be sufficient. So
yes,
so I'll leave it at that.
yes, yeah, there's so much. So indeed, this acknowledgement, the turning towards the pain, the black thread, right? The turning towards the painful truth, facing the painful truth, must happen at the individual level, right? And this is a terrible thing for some people, right? But the only way to move forward, as you said, Carl Rogers, etc., is to look at that thing and then go upward. And that is what the Germans mean by Vergangenheitsbewältigung. It is like facing this difficult past, this thing that actually happened, so that we can transcend it. And indeed, like, this is one of the, and what does that look like? So at least for the comfort woman movement in Korea, as they have articulated it in various documents and pleas and court cases, an official apology is part of it, but also like educating people about this, like owning up. And so like Germany does that with National Socialism, where children are now brought to the Nuremberg Party rally grounds, and they're taught about this history, and there's an owning up to it. And so that's one of the demands to do this, because you can't just do it, once. This has to be like faced over and over again so that we are aware of this labyrinth that we don't go down. And ultimately, it's a peace movement. Ultimately, what this is like we have to, and this is why it's connected to Bertha, like we have to sort of face the fact of what war is and does, and look at the awful truth that it does to bodies and minds, not only of women, but also to soldiers themselves. Okay, PTSD, suicides, addictions, etc. Nancy Sherman has written on this, so look her up. You'll find the book. So we have to sort of like face this and like continue the work of becoming more human, right? And so this story is part of it.
So
yeah.
So I'll paint the same picture using one of the passages from the book.
Cool.
And then we'll pivot back into the conversation about like the legal dimension.
As you wish.
So, okay. Setting the stage, we have a train car full of teenage girls who are all in, who don't know where they're going. They don't know where they are. And some of them believe that they're going to be seamstresses. Some believe they're going to be nurses. There's a guard standing at the front of the train car with a gun, with a bayonet. There's a guard at the back of the train car with a gun, the bayonet. They get to a place, a city, in a country where they can't speak the language. They look out the train car. They don't know where they are. Now, that's assuming there's even a window, right? A lot of the time, there were no windows in these train cars. The door opens, and there's, quote, outside, more than 100 men were waiting. They flocked towards the girls and dragged them into the fields, end quote. You can imagine what happens from there. And this is what took place for 200,000 human beings. There's some variation, but not enough. There's way too many times this kind of situation was like the part of the living experience of human beings. And the question is, how do we properly acknowledge and address this today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that image. And that's from page 102. The quote that you just read about more than 100 men.
Yeah.
And dragging them into the fields. A valuable image to fasten upon to sort of begin one's deliberative process about this, and how to reckon with that, and what do we do now, right? So again, where are we? This is August 12th, 2021. 30 years ago on August 14th, 1991, begins the an actual victim coming forward. So there had been, the uncovering of this system, but not into, so it's not like the comfort stations were uncovered in 1991. No. What happened in 1991 is that you have an actual person for the first time come out and say, this happened to me. And that decision sort of like, it was the crack in the ice. And also it's the same thing as the Me Too, like all these other women from all over Asia, not just Korea, came forward. The Wednesday demonstrations began. The peace statue began. There's a museum in Seoul, the War and Women's Human Rights Museum. And this is a process of education. We do not get it in the United States. It's why we are doing this show today, to do what we can do. So Shall we then, Randy, talk about the international legal dimensions, or do you want to say anything else about the book?
I think that paints the picture. I mean, we can circle back in case something else shows up, but I know that this is part of what I was introduced to through you when you explained, like, okay, in 2002, the Rome Statute like actually brings it actually brings rape into the classification for a war crime, right? I know that was something that you introduced me to in The Hague years ago, and it didn't register for me. Like, for whatever reason, I didn't understand that it took us this long to package that together. Like the idea that you can organize sexual crime, it took us until 2002 to make that explicit. So I don't know, that stunned me a little, just remembering that set of information.
Yeah, it just shows you how young we are as a species. But yeah, that's also like, yeah, if you remember nothing else, the first international instrument to recognize rape as a crime is the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which is a voluntary multilateral treaty. And the way had been paid for that from these earlier ad hoc tribunals that I mentioned for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Now, to be fair, the Lieber Code, which was promulgated to govern the Civil War, did acknowledge the prohibition of rape. Okay, so that's like Francis Lieber. Don't know much about him, but I do remember that. But that's just the Civil War, right? So we're talking about, again, the international order, international relations, the value hierarchy of the world. Yeah, rape is not explicitly recognized as an international crime formally until 2002, when the Rome Statute enters into force. So before that, we mentioned the Geneva Conventions, and Geneva Convention number 4, which we said when we did our shows about Evelyn Grubb and the Geneva Conventions and her petition to the United Nations 50 years ago in 1971. The Geneva Conventions number 4, which was promulgated in 1949. So there it is, right? So as I said, Japan surrenders 1945. After World War II, given all of the horrors that happened, people were like, we need to upgrade our value hierarchy, to use your phrase, Randy, our value system. And we need to have, the Geneva Conventions upgraded, like you upgrade your software. And we have to have a Geneva Convention, as we said, there's 4, that covers rules regarding the treatment of civilians. That just wasn't done until 1949, okay, explicitly. And so you have on the 4th Geneva Convention, and feminist legal scholars talk about this distinction. There's a distinction between things that are prohibited, like no can do, and there are things that are protected against, right? These are different regimes. Things that are prohibited versus things that are protected against. Things that are protected against, that language doesn't sound as severe as a prohibition. And so what feminist legal scholars have pointed out is that you have things like pillage being prohibited in an explicit article, but there's no like explicit article. It's actually, if you look at that, and that's Article 33, the prohibition of pillaging. Article 27 mentions women, and it says, Women shall be especially protected against any attack on their honor, in particular against rape, enforced prostitution, or any form of indecent assault. So it doesn't say rape is prohibited. It says rape will be protected, rape of women will be protected against. And if you look at this Article 27, it's sort of like in this larger general observation section. And so feminist legal scholars have said, look, just like have a specific article where it says very clearly that rape is not simply protected against, but prohibited. So you do see that in the Rome Statute. So you do have like the optional protocol, 1977. We'll go into, we don't want to get too technical here, okay? But the point is that numerous things have to go on here. The being heard piece, and that's reflected in this upgrading of our instruments to reflect better a more appropriate value hierarchy. So the other thing I want to throw into the mix is that in Korea, when we're talking about what's happening with like the comfort women, the legal dimensions of this, because it's very much alive in Korea. Internationally, the Korean Council has, requested, like made statements at the Human Rights Commission and so forth. The Human Rights Council Commission, whatever label you want to refer to, it's on under both labels. What they do is they sort of issue recommendations, like you should do this. It's, not so much like a binding thing, a long story. But that body has been appealed to, and so there's that aspect of the international legal landscape, international human rights law, very complex. But I think even more interesting is what's happening in the Korean courts. And so to understand the issue here, one has to go back, and one has to go back, as you said, Randy. This is, Japan's colonization of Korea is like a piece that you absolutely have to understand this story, okay? And then another piece is something called this 1965 treaty between Korea and Japan. So this is a bilateral treaty between Korea and Japan that was negotiated under the regime of Park Chung-hee, a very controversial leader of Korea. Can't go into it now, but there was this treaty negotiated. The formal title is called the 1965 Treaty, and it's basically a treaty that was supposed to just hammer out and like put to bed all of the various claims that Korea could make on Japan as a result of Japan's colonization. This is different from the 1945 San Francisco Treaty, which also dealt with like claims for damages arising from World War II. Okay, I'm not even going to talk about that. I'm just talking about the 1965 treaty between Korea and Japan, because that treaty has become and is very relevant. You can't understand what's happening in Korea if you don't understand that there is this treaty, and that Japan's interpretation of the treaty was like, dude, this we've decided this already. Okay, like Korea, you signed this treaty in 1965, and like, why are you still complaining? Okay, we settled everything in 1965. That's Japan's interpretation. Korea's interpretation is sort of basically like the Korean government, can't make any claims against Japan, but individuals, they can. And especially when the harms that the individuals are suffering are very serious harms known as jus cogens violations, which are like just extreme harms. I don't want to get into it, but basically that's a disagreement. But like Korea has one interpretation of the treaty and Japan has another. And Korea's interpretation is, hey, these comfort women are free. And it's not just comfort women, it's also victims of forced labor, not sexual slavery, but other kinds of labor. These victims are free to make complaints against you. And this 1965 treaty does not cover, it's narrow, right? It doesn't cover the individual claims. I'm just going to stop there, Randy, to see if you have any questions or follow-up comments about the 1965 treaty before I go on. Or maybe you want to clarify. Do one of your take a step back and clarification.
That's exactly what I was planning to do. So it's not exactly on topic, but it's stuck in my mind, and so I feel like I should bring it up.
Okay.
You know, it's just I want to it's outrageous that that it's taking us so long to bring the crime of like organized systemic rape to a legal spearhead. Like it's outrageous and here's the frame. So one of my favorite people is Nicholas Roerich. And he's done many things, and one of the things he's done is he really got the international community to have us to protect cultural property. And that was back in 1935, and there was some stuff in 1907 before that which set the groundwork so that we can as a civilization we can start to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't destroy this thing because it's kind of important. Okay, this is for like big buildings, monuments, historic things, which clearly have value. And then somehow it takes us 100 years to determine that, hey, maybe this should apply to people. Like maybe we should like take people seriously too. And I said it's outrageous, right? It's an outrageous situation, and the fact that it's becoming salient to our consciousness as a civilization is a good thing. But I think that we're still at the stage of our evolutionary development and our legal progression that outrage is still the appropriate response, because it's a motivating force. It's pushing us in the direction of like, okay, we can't let this kind of thing ever happen again. And so, I mean, I know this is August, so like the Hibakusha is on my mind, and their whole phrase is, never again. And I think that I'm conflating a lot of issues now, but I think that never again is definitely an important like thing to just stress in almost every context that's related to atrocity. So, yeah, that I just wanted to just like, for people who are not deep in the legal world and don't think about this stuff ever, and history is like a tangentially important thing to them, it's like, okay, it took us this long to just like consider this and write it down.
Yeah. And I will add to that by saying, in addition to the importance of the phrase never again, let me refer to another phrase. This is a phrase used by Crystal Eastman, a feminist pacifist socialist. In 1920, she uses the phrase, now we can begin. She's referring to the 19th Amendment. So why does it take so long? Because first of all, women have to be recognized as things worthy of protection. And women had to sort of demand that they be seen in this way. And the developments in international law surrounding recognizing rape as a war crime and a crime against humanity are related to the presence of female judges at these international tribunals, because they just weren't seen. These damages, they were just not seen and salient. There's your word to the majority of men in these institutions. And so this point that you're making about, okay, so like, how long does it take for us to look at people as worthy of protection, not just monuments? Have to give it up to Jane Addams, who made that observation as well in 1907, where she was like, yo, Why is there like all this brouhaha over protecting Brunelleschi's dome when you have like women and their works, i.e., people, just being used as cannon fodder? So like we like protect the work of artists who make these monuments, but what about the women who like labor for years and years and years to make people, and how much work it takes to make like an 18-year-old person, right? So Jane Addams
Yeah.
recognizes that. Yeah, I love that. So cool. Yeah, it takes a long time. And so again, now we can begin. Like we really began in 1920. Alice Paul, who was the leader of the National Woman's Party, had a PhD and a JD, and both of those degrees were on the legal status of women and the discrimination in the law, which we're still working on, right? And so like war discriminates, it has a disparate impact on women. And so this is one of the things that's being brought to consciousness, and women are at the forefront of that. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, so I guess now we're at the limit of my knowledge about this, and so it's where I have to transition into asking questions, and maybe you can hit them out of the park, maybe not, but
Mm-hmm.
so like so where are we at today with the comfort women issue? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like, is there anything approaching a resolution as far as you're concerned, or like what's on deck?
Well, good. Great question. So let me answer that by going back to this legal history. And so first of all, this 1965 treaty, like the interpretation of that and how that interpretation, how can I say, like coheres with international law is really important. But so you have this treaty, and Kim Hak Sun in 1991 August like says, look, this happened to me. And that, empowers her and some others to file suit against Japan in Tokyo. Okay, so their first act is to file a claim in a Japanese court. And from my reading, like the Japanese court acknowledges like bad stuff happens. Okay, however, the 1965 treaty, like this issue is done. Now, what were the demands? An official apology, monetary compensation of about 150,000 US dollars, a thorough investigation of this, the revision of Japanese textbooks, and the building of a memorial museum. So when you ask what's the status of it, there's all these different, sort of pieces of it. It's widely accepted that this is a problem. And then recently, a scholar at Harvard, we mentioned this on one of our shows, came out and gave this narrative that the comfort women, this is not a problem, that these people volunteered. Okay, just Google that. So there's still like narratives out there that deny, just like there are Holocaust deniers. But pretty much at the international level, we recognize that this was a serious problem, and it has yet to be properly acknowledged by Japan, especially in Korea. So what's happened? So most recently, a court in Korea, the Seoul Central District Court, did order Japan to pay monetary compensation to 12 different comfort women. So that's like 20, that's this year. And so Japan, like this, there's the relations between Korea and Japan are not very good right now. And one of the reasons is this different interpretation of the 1965 treaty. And Japan is like, look, like we've settled this already. And Japan also did establish a fund. It's called the Asian Women's Fund. You can Google that. There's a whole Wikipedia. Like, again, this is a complex story, but they did, establish this fund and compensation, but that wasn't enough. And so you have, that's 1995. You have the Constitutional Court of Korea, different from the court that I just mentioned this year, the Seoul Central District Court. There's, just like in the United States, we have the Supreme Court, we have state courts, we have municipal courts. Sorry, it's just a complex landscape out there. But the Constitutional Court in 2011 said, look, Korea, Korea, have to do something about this issue. So like through diplomacy, because these are your citizens, and our Constitution says that citizens' dignity will be protected and so forth. And so you need to do something about this. So that's 2011. So you have the courts in Korea making these judgments. And that's really where we are today. And so when you ask, like, what's the resolution? Like, there have been special rapporteurs at the UN, and I don't know what happened. I know that the Korean Council organized a petition, and it was delivered to the then head of the Human Rights Council. Maybe this was like 2017. But that's not the only thing that they want. They want Japan to sort of like officially issue an apology, to officially change its textbooks, and that has not been done. So there we are. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but there it is. That's the best I can do.
Well, I mean, that fills in a lot of the blanks. I mean, I know these things take a lot of time, and it's unclear like how much of this information or this story ought to be part of the public narrative, the collective consciousness. It's like, it's hard to say, right? Like how many history books in the United States should have a chapter on this? It's an impossible question, I think. But as far as I'm concerned, this is a piece of the global puzzle where we're starting to understand just how horrific things can be. And like we're for the first time in history, we're at a place where we actually have the legal machinery to address the issues at least a little. Maybe it doesn't rectify the situation. Maybe it doesn't make it all better, right? I don't think it does. I don't think that anything is ever going to just like wash the blood off this nightmare or anything even, but it's like, it's something. And the clip from last time where Howard Thurman was reading from Olive Schreiner, where it's like, little, I forget exactly how it goes, but it's like, you're a little person and you can only do a little thing, but do it. It's not nothing. That's speaking to me now. It's like here we are as a global community inching forward through just like truckloads of blood, and we're slowly starting to actually get to do something. And acknowledgement and then legal ramifications are the first step, and then there's like this cultural process where we start to bring people to consciousness, or bring the information associated with an event like this to people's consciousness. And that, I mean, if it's anything close to what happened with me, and I'm assuming with you as well, it's like the system associated with this is so repulsive to me now that like I know I wouldn't be complicit in it, and I would do everything that I could to deal with like preventing it. Whatever I can do, I will. And I think that like as that becomes the default, culturally as a force, that pressure to make the world have less of the atrocity stuff, it's like the more that happens, the better the world kind of becomes. And I know that's idealistic, but that's who I am. So
Well,
here we
it's
are.
inch by inch, and it's not going to happen in our lifetime or the lifetime of our would-be grandchildren, were we to have any. But this is the process of the species, which is always to inch towards betterment, right? That is this sort of vision that we're looking at, and it's one of the presumptions of this show, and all the stories that we talk about. One thing, like you said, we have the legal machinery, and so like really, if I'm going to sort of distill, again, going back to this like structure of values or hierarchy of values, I think this is it. Like it's not just having like the technical system and treaties, it's also the hierarchy of values implicit in those. And what we're dealing with now is, number one, state sovereignty. Number two, state immunity. And number three, redress of individual victims. There's like a big scholarship about, okay, we have this notion of human rights and individual human dignity, but do we have the machinery that allows individuals access to tribunals where they can get a remedy, international tribunals in some cases? Because as it is now, the tribunals are really set up, and the regime of human rights, international courts, it's not so much like at the level of individual access. There are some exceptions. This is a long story, but this is part of the work that needs to be done. So Randy, at the ICJ, right? It's just like that's the court of the UN, and that court just deals with conflicts between states. Okay. So one question is, there's last I checked, there's 16 remaining registered comfort women in Korea. 16. If they feel that they have not received a proper remedy, what can they do? And if their proper remedy involves a court of law, what court can they go to? Can they go to the Human Rights Council? If it's not a court, right? It's a political body. Long story behind it. But if they want like some sort of like court official remedy, this kind of thing, where can they go? So they've gone to Japan. Japan said no. 1965 agreement has decided the issue. You can't come here. So then they went to the Korean courts, and the Korean court said, some of them said yes. Korean court, as again, 2011, Constitutional Court said, court to government, you have to do something. Okay. This is a long story. And then in 2021, now the court says, Japan, you have to pay. I don't know if Japan's going to pay. I don't think they will. But then the question is, so is there a court where these women can get a remedy? And is the remedy, I think this is an important question, is the remedy solely legal? And I think the answer to that is no. If you look at the actual like requests, the building of a memorial museum, that was done. That's done. It's in Seoul. And Japanese citizens helped to build that. What is wanting is that the Japanese government officially, goes and builds it. This kind of like that. This is, as I understand it, this is the complaint of some of the claimants who are not satisfied. I want to add also that this Asian Woman Fund and some other funds that were set up, actual victims did take that money, and they I think, I don't know, have they been made, what we say in the law, have they been made whole? This is the question. And what role do the courts play in that? Can they have a role? This is where we are today. But Japan, at least at the international level, has said, you can't, these individuals can't make complaints against us because we're like the king. We're a state, and there's such a doctrine called state immunity, and you are barred from making complaints against us. So there's this whole like I don't want this to be technical, but your statement, Randy, about like we have the machinery. The machinery still has some areas that need to be worked out, and we're working them out now. So again, it's like sovereign immunity, um, and the right of individual victims to get redress when these harms have been so like such serious violations. I'll stop.
Well, okay, so point taken. The legal machinery is far from complete.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that we have any disagreement there, but I mean, I think that there's a non-trivial component to noticing the difference between where we are today and where we were maybe 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because that's not a lot of time, considering how long it takes for like legal things to change.
Mm-hmm.
Like 100 years ago, we didn't have any, like it wasn't even like the individual had no one to talk to.
And
There wasn't.
individual women.
Well, individual women, they didn't even, they weren't, there was zero, right? It was zero. It was,
Mhm.
it was shut up, go home. And
Mhm.
now it's crap. We aren't sure if we can make this work yet, which, I mean, that's a substantial improvement. So, I mean, this is my,
Indeed. I agree.
optimistic bend.
Oh,
Now, I just, I know we're kind of bumping into our time limit here. So,
yep. Maybe you
um,
want to bracket it and we can come back. Like maybe you
yeah,
want to just like put it out there now so we can chew on it at least
yeah. I
if you
mean,
can.
I know what I want to do is come back to the book and
Mm,
come back to the story and end on a point that's emphasizing the individual components here.
okay.
Um, I mean, at least for me, that's always what's salient. And so it's like we're dealing with individual people, a lot of them. And in the case of the comfort women, the kind of harm was extreme to the absolute limit. You know, I've spent a lot of time studying atrocities. I'd highly recommend reading One Day in the Life of Ivan Desanovich, which gives you a vision of like imprisonment and internment camps in the Soviet Union.
Is
Answered
that
from
Dostoevsky?
yeah. So
Mm,
yes, it's Dostoevsky's, rendition. Um, so it's like when we try to imagine the life of a single person inside of a situation like this, we get a different frame of reference than when we think about it from a museum,
mm,
right? When we think about like trying to understand the event historically, it's like, okay, we can see how this changed cultural attitudes. We can see how this made laws. We can understand how this cost a lot of money. And all that's important, right? But it's really different to imagine, like, okay, here's a person who wakes up in the morning and has to do what? And then they do what? And then this happens?
mm.
Oh, and it happens every day? Oh, it happens every day for years? Oh, and the way that the human body responds to that kind of unbelievably difficult set of circumstances is what? Your body starts to do what? It's like you get the visceral component when you think about it from the frame of an individual. And there are these books that are written that are informed by firsthand accounts of stuff. And so I want to go back. One Day in the Life of Ivan Desanovich isn't Dostoevsky. It's Solzhenitsyn, the guy who writes Gulag Archipelago. So this is his story. He was talking about it because he was there. This isn't like a historical reflection. So I got thrown off there. It wasn't Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky wrote him a lot of stuff too, and I'm happy to talk about him forever. But this is Solzhenitsyn, whose literary work had a role to play in bringing down the Soviet Union by actually pointing to what took place in the Gulag Archipelago. So, anyways, cleaning that mistake up there. So, anyway, it's like when we talk about an experience, the human mind frames it through narrative best. Like that's how we convey. Like there's a reason storytelling has a main character, and like when you read a story, there's a main character. Why? Well, that's how we learn. That's how we think. There's a narrative structure to our entire consciousness. We could talk about the neuroscience of that another time, but like the story One Left by Kim Soom, it gets you there, right? It gets you there. You get as close as you can to understanding how bad it gets when hell is brought to earth and perpetuated by people.
Yeah, and I take it that this is my summation, and after I say this, we will sign off.
Well, yeah, unless you want to change the time frame, but yeah, this is appropriate conclusion point.
Okay.
I imagine.
Okay, so to follow up on this idea of there's been progress, but there's much work to be done. Again, Crystal Eastman, Now We Can Begin. One of the things that is going to and has helped to bring to consciousness the individual, the sacrament of the individual, is the notion of human dignity, which you see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This concept is extremely important. We don't know what it means. When I teach philosophy of law, we spend the whole class focused on the concept of dignity. Nonetheless, we have a sense of what it means, and it has to do with the person. And I think that that's sort of like the value these days, that like it comes up. It came up in the Korean cases that these women have dignity, and that the constitutional regime of Korea has a duty to protect the dignity of its citizens. It is the sort of core value, and it gets at this importance of the individual. So I would like to end by reading at least one quote, and this is from page 169 of the book The Internationalists, which is about it's about the peace through law movement. I'll put it that way. It came out in 2017, and Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro, who teach at Yale Law School, an excellent book. So the passage I'm going to read talks about the unraveling of the old world order, that they call it. And the old world order is like this view, this narrative that I began talking about with Bertha von Suttner when she writes Lay Down Your Arms. The dominant narrative of war is that it's totally fine. It is a legitimate way to right any wrong, however trivial. That if a country's honor is insulted, it can go it can go to war, okay, and it could summon structures to remedy any harm, however slight. That's the old world order. And this book talks about how that has been dismantled and is being reworked. So this passage, again, page 169, The Internationalists by Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro. Quote, like a thread that hangs from a sweater, the League, and they mean League of Nations, tugged on the strand until the fabric began to unravel. And though the unraveling would not happen all at once, there would be no way to stop it once it began, unquote. I think that human dignity and the injection of that concept into the international order, international relations, has begun a process of unraveling that can only stop with the abolition of these crimes and of the practice that leads to these crimes. And that will bring me to the second quote that I'll read. I said at least one. The second quote is from the judgment of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, October 1st, 1946. A watershed moment in the peace through law movement. And of course, this is the military tribunal that deals with the crimes of the Nazis during World War II. There was a separate tribunal, Tokyo Tribunal. Long story. Here's the quote. War is essentially an evil thing. Its consequences are not confined to the belligerent states alone, but affect the whole world. To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is a supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes, and that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. Japan was found to be waging a war of aggression. They did attack Pearl Harbor. We were a neutral country. And this quote is saying that act, that decision, unleashes all of these other crimes. We've been talking about one of them, which is not really recognized as a crime until 2002. It's not funny. But as you said, Randy, like how long does it take? And so this is a process of waking up, and praise be to Kim Hak Sun. So like we hear you, like that's why we're doing the show today. That decision for her to do that, and again, she's 67 years old when she decides to do this, and she died in 1997. But like that decision, right? So there's like the decision to wage aggressive war, which has all of these effects. And there's this decision to come forward with the truth, however painful, which has all of these effects. And that's what we've been talking about. And so I think I'm going to stop there. Randy, you have any final thoughts? Or is that it?
I mean, just to echo, I mean, we remember. We're doing what we can to pass the torch of history, despite the fact that it burns our hands. And yeah, we remember.
Mm-hmm. And we hear and we will continue to listen and learn, which is another duty that we have, is to continue educating ourselves. And we have numerous show resources on our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. Several Wikipedia pages on individual comfort women, as well as a link to a good documentary. It's called The Apology, and it came out, I think, in 2017. That's a decent place to begin as well, or continue, I should say. So I really, again, I want to thank the Korean consulate in Chicago for sending us these books so we could have this discussion on this day. I really am grateful to Young Sok Kim and Miso Kim. Thank you so much. And of course, also to Bruce and Ju-Chan Fulton and Kim Soom for their work in transmitting this narrative to us. So I will leave it there for now. And you have been listening to Virtues of Peace. We will be back with some shows on Lay Down Your Arms, the book that I began talking about by Bertha von Suttner, Take care and goodbye. virtuesofpeace.com.